They say in Halifax, you never make eye contact with a man who arrives in a convoy. But what if that man walks into the hospice where you work, dressed in a coat that costs more than your annual salary, holding the trembling hand of a little boy who hasn't spoken a word in 7 months? Bryn Calloway was just a palliative care aide at Harbour Light Hospice, drowning in student debt and trying to keep her younger brother out of trouble long enough to graduate high school. She thought she was just being kind to a quiet child who showed up every Tuesday and Thursday in the family visiting lounge, always alone except for a rotation of stiff-suited men who sat across the room staring at their phones. She didn't realize that by sitting on the floor beside that little boy and teaching him to fold origami cranes, she was stepping into a war she couldn't see. This isn't a fairy tale. This is what happens when compassion collides with power. The hospice smelled the way all hospices do, antiseptic underneath something floral, an attempt at comfort that never quite lands. Bryn had stopped noticing it in her second week on the job. By October, 18 months in, she moved through the pale corridors of Harbour Light the way water moves through familiar pipes, quietly, efficiently, without thinking too hard about where she was going. She was 26. She had a diploma in personal support work from NSCC, a part-time evening shift at a grocery store in Dartmouth, and a persistent knot between her shoulder blades that never fully released. Her father had passed in this building 2 years ago, a fact she had disclosed on her application and which her supervisor, a warm Acadian woman named Georgette, had accepted with the kind of practical compassion only people in this field seem to possess. Grief, Georgette had told her during orientation, makes better caregivers than ambition does. The boy first appeared on a Tuesday in early November. He came in with a man Bryn would later learn was called Marsh. Thick neck, earpiece, the kind of posture that suggested military or something adjacent to it. The boy was maybe 7. He wore a navy wool coat that fit him perfectly, the kind of coat that was made for him specifically, not pulled off a rack at Walmart. His hair was dark, a little too long, curling at the ears. His eyes were the pale grey of the harbour in winter. They sat in the family lounge, a room of mismatched armchairs and a bookshelf of donated paperbacks, while Marsh took a call in the corner. The boy sat very straight in his chair, hands folded in his lap, staring at nothing. Bryn was passing through with a linens trolley when she noticed he hadn't moved in 20 minutes. She stopped. She knew she shouldn't engage. Technically, this room was for family members of patients, and she had rounds to finish. But something about the absolute stillness of him broke something open in her chest. She had seen adults sit like that in this room. She had never seen a child do it. She detoured to the small craft station near the window, a basket of supplies Georgette kept stocked for visiting grandchildren, and pulled out a square of orange paper. She sat cross-legged on the floor, not near him, not addressing him, just close enough. She began folding, crease down the center. Corners to the middle, the familiar geometry of a paper crane she'd learned from her grandmother. She felt him watching before she saw it. A tiny lean forward, barely anything. The adjustment a sunflower makes toward light. It's a crane, she said, not looking up. Supposed to be anyway. Mine always end up looking more like a very confused duck. Nothing, but he didn't look away. She held it up anyway. Lopsided beak, asymmetrical wings. Definitely more duck than crane. And there, just a flicker, the corner of his mouth moved. She placed the crane on the arm of the chair beside him and went back to her trolley. She didn't wait for a response. She had learned in this building that sometimes presence is the whole gift. When she came back through 40 minutes later, the crane was gone. The boy had tucked it into the pocket of his beautiful coat. That was how it started. For 6 weeks, every Tuesday and Thursday, Bryn brought paper. Sometimes she folded at the craft table while he watched. Sometimes she left supplies beside him and went to her rounds, coming back to find a rough, determined attempt at a box or a boat sitting on the chair. He had clearly been practicing at home. The shapes got better faster than she expected. Marsh watched all of this from his corner. He never interfered, never smiled, just watched with the focused neutrality of a man paid to notice things. The boy didn't speak, not once. He communicated in other ways. A pointed finger when he wanted a different color paper, a slow shake of his head when Bryn suggested a frog. Too complicated, apparently. A single grave nod when she asked if he wanted her to show him the lotus. She learned his name from the visitor log she wasn't technically supposed to read, Alexander, age 7. Visiting a patient named Yeva Volkov in room 14. Room 14 was one of the palliative suites. Bryn didn't provide direct care in that wing. That was the RN's. But she knew from the common knowledge of small institutions that the woman in 14 had been there for 11 weeks and was not expected to see Christmas. She didn't ask Alexander about it. She brought paper. She sat on the floor. She folded. On the last Tuesday of November, he slid off his chair and sat cross-legged beside her on the floor. Bryn kept folding. She didn't make it a big deal. But her hands were not entirely steady for the rest of the afternoon. It was Georgette who first said it out loud. "That child looks at you like you're the only solid thing in the room," she said one evening, watching from the doorway as Bryn and Alexander sat surrounded by a small fleet of paper boats. "Who's the woman in 14 to him?" "His grandmother, I think," Bryn said. Georgette made a sound that contained an entire paragraph. Poor lamb. The day everything changed was a Wednesday, not one of his regular days. Bryn was in the supply room counting gauze pads when she heard the front entrance. Not heard, exactly, felt. The way air pressure changes when something large moves through a space. She came out into the corridor and stopped. 4 black suburban SUVs were visible through the glass front doors, lined up along the hospice's modest circular drive. 2 men in dark coats had already come inside and were speaking in low voices to the front desk administrator, who looked the way people look when they're very carefully not panicking. Then, the door opened again. The man who walked in was not large in the way Marsh was large. He was tall, but it was the quality of his stillness that took up all the space. He wore a dark charcoal overcoat, open over a suit that required no introduction, dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had been set against something difficult for a very long time, a scar, thin and pale, running from the outer edge of his left eyebrow toward his temple. He did not look at the front desk. He did not look at Bryn. He looked at Alexander, who had come in behind him, still in his coat, clutching a fistful of orange paper. Alexander looked at his father. Bryn understood immediately that this was his father, and then looked across the lobby until he found her. He pointed at her. The man's gaze moved. It found Bryn standing in the corridor with a box of gauze and absolutely nowhere to hide. "You," the man said. His voice was low and carried across the lobby without effort, a voice accustomed to being heard without being raised. "You're the one who sits on the floor with him, it wasn't a question." "I'm a care aide," Bryn said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Alexander visits during my shift. We fold paper sometimes." The man crossed the lobby. He stopped a few feet from her. Up close, his eyes were a very dark green, the color of lake water in November, and they were doing something she could only describe as inventory, taking her apart into component pieces and assessing each one. "He showed me this," the man said. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a paper crane. Slightly squashed, obviously carried for some time. "He keeps them. He has 14 of them in a box on his dresser." Bryn didn't know what to say to that. "He hasn't spoken since April," the man said. 7 months. He watched his grandmother survive a car accident in St. Petersburg that killed 2 of my men. He was in the back seat. The words were delivered with the flat precision of a man who had told this story to doctors and therapists and had stripped all the flesh off it. The trauma was significant. He's been mute since. The fluorescent light of the hospice hummed above them. Alexander had drifted to the craft table and was already sorting through the paper. "I'm sorry," Bryn said, and meant it in the way people mean it in this building, which is the deepest way. "His grandmother is dying," the man said. "She has perhaps 2 weeks. When she goes, he loses the last person who was in that car with him, the last person who understands what he carries." He paused. He has spoken to no one in 7 months. He has engaged with no one. Until you. He looked at Alexander, and for just a moment the inventory behind his eyes became something else. Something raw and helpless that a man like this would never let anyone see for long. "I need to ask you something," he said, looking back at her, "and I need you to understand that I don't ask things. I arrange them." "That's a concerning way to begin a question," Bryn said. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. The memory of one, maybe. "My name is Nikolai Dravkov," he said. "I need someone who can be with Alexander when his grandmother passes. Not a nanny, not a therapist. He's refused both." He glanced toward the craft table. "Someone who will sit on the floor with him and not demand anything. Someone he has already chosen." "I have a job," Bryn said. "I'm aware. Harbor Light, Tuesday and Thursday evening shifts plus 3 morning shifts per week. You also work at the Sobeys on Windmill Road on Monday and Friday evenings." He said it without inflection, like reading from a document. "You have $43,000 in student debt and your brother Callum is on academic probation at Citadel High." The bottom dropped out of Bryn's stomach. "How do you know that?" she said. It was not a question. "I know things," Dravkov said simply. "It's how I've survived long enough to stand here." He reached into his coat again and produced a card. "Matte black, no logo, just a number. Your debt cleared. Callum's tuition covered through graduation. A salary that will make your current 2 jobs look like pocket change. In exchange, you come with us tonight and you stay until Alexander is stable." "You're asking me to leave with a man I've never met," Bryn said. "To go? Where?" "My estate, northwest of the city. 30 minutes. And if I say no, then you go back to your gauze pads," Dravkov said quietly. And tomorrow Alexander comes here on Tuesday, and you fold paper with him for an hour, and then he goes back to a house full of men trained to kill people who cannot do anything for a 7-year-old boy who is learning. Right now, what it means to lose everything. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten her. He just told her the truth, and the truth was worse than a threat. Bryn looked at Alexander, who was holding up a half-folded crane, checking the symmetry with one eye closed. She untied her lanyard and set it on the supply cart. "I need to call my brother," she said. Dravkov stepped aside. Of course. The drive was 32 minutes, Bryn counted. She sat in the second row of the Suburban, Alexander between her and the window, his shoulder pressed against her arm. Dravkov rode in the front passenger seat and did not speak. A man Bryn didn't know drove. Another followed behind in a second vehicle. Alexander had brought the paper. He folded in the dark with the muscle memory of someone who has done it many times, his small fingers finding the creases without looking. Outside, Halifax gave way to the Highway 102 corridor, then turned north onto roads Bryn didn't recognize. The trees closed in, the subdivisions thinned, and then, at the end of a long gravel road flanked by birches with their bark gone silver in the headlights, a gate, stone pillars, a security booth, and beyond it, a house that was not a house in any sense Bryn had ever lived in. It was a converted Georgian manor, 3 stories of cream-painted brick with a slate roof and windows that glowed amber against the November dark. "Welcome to Birchwood," Dravkov said, his first words since the hospice. Inside was warmer than she expected and quieter than a building that size should be. A woman named Mrs. Deschênes, 60s, the particular severity of someone who has run a large household for decades and resents any implication that it is difficult, met them at the door. She looked at Bryn the way a border agent looks at an unfamiliar passport. "The East Guest Suite," Dravkov told her, next to Alexander's room. Mrs. Deschênes led Bryn upstairs without warmth and with considerable efficiency. The room was larger than Bryn's apartment. Cream walls, a window seat looking out over what she guessed was a garden, now buried under the first real snow of the season. A wardrobe had been stocked with clothes in roughly her size, practical things, warm things, nothing flashy. Someone had done this before she arrived, which meant it had been arranged before Dravkov had even asked her. That thought was not entirely comfortable. She found Alexander in his room when Mrs. Deschênes left her to settle in. He had appeared at her door within minutes, clearly having no intention of staying in his own room alone. His space was enormous and impeccably furnished, and had the particular emptiness of a room that a child lives in but doesn't yet inhabit. His crane sat in a shoebox on the dresser, exactly as his father had said, 14 of them orange and white and 1 deep red. She sat on the window seat. He sat beside her, leaning against her arm the same way he had in the car. They watched the snow for a while. "This is a very big house," Bryn said. He nodded. "Does it feel big to you?" A pause, then another nod, slower. "Our apartment was pretty small," she said. "After my dad died, my mum and Callum and I lived in a 2-bedroom in Dartmouth for years. You could hear everything through the walls." She paused. "Sometimes I still miss the noise." Alexander was very still beside her. But it was a different kind of still than the hospice, not the stillness of a child shutting himself down. It was the stillness of someone listening with their whole body. She stayed until he fell asleep, which took less time than she expected, his head on a pillow, her hand resting loosely near his. She sat for a while longer after, looking at the snow and the dark line of the birch trees at the edge of the property, thinking about how far she was from Windmill Road and gauze pads and everything she understood. She was halfway down the hall looking for water when she noticed the door. It was not a bedroom door. It was narrower, set back in an alcove, and it was open maybe 3 centimeters, just enough to show a sliver of light, the blue-white of a monitor, not the warm amber of a lamp. She knew she shouldn't. She had been in this house for 3 hours. She knew the basic geometry. Main floor belonged to Dravkov, east wing belonged to Alexander. She was a guest who had not been invited to explore, but the light was the particular blue of security monitors. She recognized it from the ward at the hospice, where they had a camera system in the nursing station. She pushed the door. It was a small room, shelving, filing boxes, and against the far wall a monitor split into 6 feeds. She recognized the front gate, the driveway, the main foyer, Alexander's room, where the shoebox of cranes sat on the dresser and she could see his small shape under the duvet, and one feed pointed at the room she'd been given. Her window seat, her bed currently empty. She stood in the blue light and felt, for the first time since the hospice lobby, genuinely afraid. On the wall beside the monitor, taped at eye level, was a drawing. She leaned closer. Alexander's work. She knew his style by now, the heavy crayon pressure, the careful detail where detail mattered to him. This drawing showed a road. 2 vehicles, black, tipped on their sides, red crayon for fire, and standing at the edge of the scene, a figure, tall, dark coat. one arm raised, palm out, as if commanding something, or silencing someone. Bryn felt the cold of the room settle into her lungs. Dravkov had told her his son witnessed a car accident. He had said his grandmother survived. He had said the trauma was significant. But Alexander had drawn this, and the figure in the drawing was not helping. She heard the floorboard behind her before she could move. She turned. Dravkov stood in the doorway, a glass of water in one hand, his coat gone, his suit jacket open. He looked at her, he looked at the monitor showing her empty bed. He looked at the drawing. "I told you," he said, and his voice was very quiet, "that there are parts of this house that aren't for you." "Who is that?" Bryn asked, pointing at the drawing. Her voice shook slightly, but she didn't look away. "In the drawing? Who is the figure telling them to be quiet?" Dravkov's jaw tightened. He crossed the room, not fast, but inevitable, and stood beside her, looking at his son's drawing. "Look at the left hand," he said. Bryn looked. She had missed it. Alexander's crayon was dark and the room was blue-lit. But on the figure's left hand, raised and commanding, there was a mark, not a ring. A tattoo, rendered in the heavy black lines of a child trying to remember something exactly. A cross. The kind that branched into 4 equal arms. A specific kind. "His name is Gregor Rusenko," Dravkov said. "He said the name the way you say a diagnosis. He was my head of logistics for 8 years. He arranged the route my vehicles took the day of the accident. He arranged the other things that happened on that road." He paused. It was not an accident. Bryn's hand found the wall. "Someone tried to kill your son," she said. "Someone tried to kill me," Dravkov said. "My son and my mother-in-law were not supposed to be in those vehicles. There was a change of plans at the last moment." He exhaled. "They were supposed to be nowhere near it. The horror of it arrived in stages, the way cold does." "Alexander saw him," Bryn said. "At the scene. He saw Yusenko. He saw a man give an order," Dravkov said, "and then stand and watch. He saw his grandmother pulled from the wreckage. He saw the man look at them both, and he has not spoken a word since because someone told him to be quiet." Dravkov looked at her. For a moment, in the blue light, he looked less like a man who ran convoys and arranged things, and more like a father who had been failing to protect his child for 7 months and knew it. "Yusenko is still in my organization," he said. "I cannot move against him without evidence. If I move too early, he disappears and we lose him. If I wait too long..." He stopped, looked at the monitor showing Alexander's room. "He knows my son saw. He has been patient. But my mother-in-law is dying. When she goes, the last witness from that road is a 7-year-old boy who won't speak." He looked at Bryn. "Alexander draws what he saw. He won't show me. I think he believes I'll be angry. Or worse, that I'll think it's his fault. Children do that. They carry guilt for things done to them." His voice caught, barely, then steadied. "But he showed you a crane on the 2nd Tuesday. He showed you, which means he chose you." "You need him to tell you what he saw," Bryn said. "I need him to be able to tell someone," Dravkov said. "Not for the court. There will be no court. I need him to stop carrying it alone." Bryn looked at the drawing, at the careful black lines of the cross tattoo on the figure's hand, at the red crayon fire, at the small figure at the edge of the scene, a child, rendered with the particular economy of a child drawing themselves, just an oval head and stick legs and 2 lines for arms. One of those arms was reaching toward the large, dark figure, not away, toward, like asking for help. "He's been trying to tell someone," Bryn said quietly. "For 7 months. He's been drawing it over and over, and nobody saw it." Dravkov said nothing. "Okay," she said. "I'll stay." He handed her the glass of water he'd been holding this entire time. "Lock your door," he said. "Yusenko has access to this property. He doesn't know we suspect him. Until I can confirm what we have, you and Alexander don't go anywhere without me or my man Thomas." Bryn nodded. She was still looking at the drawing. "Yes, the camera in my room comes down tomorrow." Dravkov looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "it does." The next days had the texture of a held breath. Bryn learned the rhythms of Birchwood the way she had learned the hospice, by moving through it quietly and paying attention. Mrs. Deschênes remained frosty but efficient, leaving Alexander's meals outside his door on a tray if Bryn wasn't present, which she always was. A man named Thomas materialized whenever they left any room, large, quiet, with the patience of someone who spent a lot of time waiting. He reminded her of Marsh, and she found, oddly, that she trusted him for the same reason she'd trusted Marsh. He never pretended to be something else. Gregor Usenko came to Birchwood on the 3rd day. Bryn knew him before anyone said his name. She was in the solarium with Alexander, a glass-walled room off the east wing, better for paper folding because of the light, when she heard a vehicle on the drive. Through the glass, she watched a man walk toward the front entrance. Medium height, heavy-set, grey at the temples. He wore his left coat sleeve, pushed slightly up on the wrist, a habit probably. She could not see his hand clearly, but she watched Alexander. Alexander had been showing her how to make a modular cube, 12 sheets, interlocking, his most ambitious project yet. When the vehicle appeared on the drive, his hands went still. He didn't look up. He just stopped, the way a small animal stops when it hears something that isn't right. "Hey," Bryn said quietly. "Look at me." He looked at her. "Keep going," she said. "Show me the next fold." He held her gaze for a moment, checking something. Then he looked back at the paper, but his hands were shaking. That evening after Alexander was asleep, Bryn found Dravkov in his study. The first time she had been in the room. Bookshelves to the ceiling, maps on one wall, a desk that looked like it had been used hard for a long time. "Yusenko was here today," she said. "I know." Alexander recognized him. His hands started shaking. Dravkov looked up from the papers in front of him. "He didn't look directly at him," Bryn said. "He kept his eyes on me, which means he's learned to control his reaction. A 7-year-old has learned to hide fear from the man who terrified him." She sat down in the chair across the desk without being invited. "That's not okay." "No," Dravkov said. "I need to ask you something." He waited. "The morning of the accident, you said there was a last-minute change of plans. That Alexander and your mother-in-law weren't supposed to be on that road." "Yes. Who knew about the change?" Dravkov was very still. "My head of logistics," he said. "Yusenko, and who arranged the new route? The one your vehicles ended up taking." The silence in the study was long enough to hear the snow against the windows. "He did," Dravkov said. "Then he knew," Bryn said. "He knew your family was in those cars and he gave the order anyway." She leaned forward. "Your son didn't just witness a hit on you. He witnessed someone choose to let his grandmother die. He saw that man look at him afterward. A man who knew exactly who he was." Dravkov stood up slowly. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her for a long moment. "There's a cross tattoo," Bryn said. On the left hand, Alexander drew it. 4 equal arms. Dravkov turned. "A Maltese pattern," he said, "old. Yusenko has had it since before I knew him. I never thought." He stopped. "I looked at those drawings for months. I thought he was drawing the accident. I didn't look at what he the accident." "He was drawing what he remembered," Bryn said. "He was telling you exactly what he saw. He just needed someone to look at the details." Something shifted in Dravkov's face. Not softness, the man seemed structurally incapable of what most people meant by softness, but something adjacent to it, a loosening around the eyes. The specific expression of a person who has been carrying a thing alone for so long that putting it down, even briefly, requires visible physical effort. "I should have looked," he said. "You were grieving," Bryn said, "and afraid. Those things make you look at the large shapes. It takes a different kind of attention to see the small ones." He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she became aware of the fire in the hearth and the sound of wind in the birches outside. "You're very calm," he said. "For someone who has been in this house 3 days and learned more about its dangers than most of my men know." "I work in palliative care," Bryn said. "Calm is a skill." The corner of his mouth moved. Just slightly, the same way his sons had, that first Tuesday in the family lounge. "Go back to Alexander," he said. "Don't direct it. Don't ask about it. Just let it happen. And Yusenko." "Yusenko," Dravkov said, "is my problem. I have what I need." She was almost at the door when he said her name. She turned. "Bryn." He said it carefully, like a word in a language he was still learning. "Thank you." She nodded and went back to the East Wing. What happened 2 days later was fast and disorganized in the way real danger always is. Nothing like the movies, all noise and adrenaline and bad footing. She heard it from the solarium. Shouts from the east side of the property, then a sound she recognized from nothing in her actual life, but knew immediately and viscerally for what it was. She grabbed Alexander, who had gone white and completely still, and moved. She didn't think. She thought later, for a long time, about what she would have done if she had stopped to think. Instead, she moved. She got Alexander into the interior bathroom off the east hallway. No windows, solid door, the kind of room that exists in large old houses for no good modern reason, and was right now exactly what she needed. And she locked the door and put her back against it and held Alexander against her side. She felt him shaking, or she was shaking both, probably. "Hey," she said very quietly, "look at me." He looked at her. His eyes were enormous. "Breathe," she said, "like the paper. Fold in, fold out, slow." She demonstrated. He followed. His breathing hitched once, twice, then began to even out. They stayed like that for 11 minutes, which she counted. Then the handle rattled and a voice she recognized, Tomas, said through the door, "Mrs. Calloway, you can come out now." She didn't move immediately. "Tell me something only you would know." A pause. Then the boys' cranes, 14 of them. Orange, white, and 1 red. She unlocked the door. Tomas's face was professionally neutral in the way she was coming to recognize as the default expression of men who worked for Dravkov. He was bleeding from a cut above his ear. He did not acknowledge this. "Mr. Dravkov is asking for you both," he said. Dravkov was in the main foyer. His coat was gone. His suit jacket was torn at the shoulder. He was speaking in low, rapid Russian to a man with a phone pressed to his ear, and he stopped mid-sentence when Alexander came through the doorway. He crossed the foyer in 6 strides and dropped to one knee so that he was at his son's height. He said something in Russian. Quiet. Alexander looked at his father's torn shoulder. He reached out with one small hand and touched it, gently, like checking the temperature of something uncertain. Then Alexander opened his mouth. "You're safe," he said. His voice was barely there, rough from months of silence, unsure of itself, like a sound made by an instrument that hasn't been played in a long time. The room went absolutely still. Dravkov's face did something extraordinary, something that had nothing to do with power or patience or the particular calculus of a man who arranged things. It just broke open. "Yes," he said in English. His voice was not steady. "I'm safe. You're safe. Where?" He stopped. He pulled Alexander against his chest and held him, one hand on the back of his son's head, and said nothing else for a long time. Bryn stood in the doorway of the foyer and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and made a completely undignified sound that she would later blame on the stress. Yusenko was arrested at the Stanfield airport 3 hours later, trying to board a private charter to Montreal. Dravkov had given a number of documents to a particular RCMP officer. The transaction had the feeling of something that had been prepared well in advance, and the matter was dealt with in the orderly, airless way that powerful men deal with things when they have decided enough is enough. Bryn's mother-in-law, Alexander's grandmother Yeva, passed on a Saturday morning in mid-December, with Alexander holding her hand and Dravkov standing at the window, and Bryn near the door in case she was needed and staying out of the way because she was not. After, Alexander cried for a long time. Real crying, the full-body, uncontrolled kind that his silence had been holding back for 7 months. He cried in Dravkov's lap and then in Bryn's arms and then fell asleep on the family lounge couch at the hospice, his face flushed and exhausted and, for the first time since November, genuinely young. Dravkov sat in the chair across from them. He looked at Bryn over his sleeping son's head. "What do you want?" he said. Bryn blinked. "Sorry, I mean it as a question," he said. "Not a transaction. What do you actually want? Not for Callum. Not for your debt. For yourself." She thought about it seriously. "To do this work properly," she said, "the hospice, I want to finish my RN. I've been deferring the program for 4 years. That's it? And a window seat," she said. "I'd like one that's mine." Something in his expression was very careful and very deliberate when he said, "I have a house with several." 6 months later, Harbour Light Hospice had a new position on its volunteer coordination committee, a community liaison role, unfunded previously, now funded through a private donation made through a numbered company that Bryn did not ask about. She completed her first semester of the Accelerated RN Bridging program at Dalhousie in April. Callum passed his year. Alexander spoke in full sentences now. He had opinions about breakfast and strong preferences about which birch tree was best for climbing, and had recently become interested in whether Bryn thought his father was, quote, too serious. "Sometimes," Bryn told him honestly. "He laughs when you say things," Alexander said, with the observational gravity of a small scientist documenting a phenomenon. "Does he?" Not out loud, but here. He pointed to the space beside his own eyes. "It goes there. He thinks you can't see it." She looked up from the paper she was folding. Across the solarium, through the glass, she could see Dravkov walking the property line with Tomas, hands clasped behind his back, the birches bare and bright in the spring light. He glanced toward the glass without stopping. The look lasted maybe 2 seconds, but she saw it. "Okay," she said to Alexander. "What should I fold next?" He handed her a square of orange paper. "Something that takes a long time," he said. On the workbench between them, surrounded by cranes and boxes and small, improbable paper structures that had accumulated over months, Alexander picked up a fresh sheet and began to fold. Neat, assured, deliberate. The hands of a boy learning, slowly, that the things that break us into silence don't have to keep us there. Outside, the birches were putting out their first green of the year. It was small and tentative, and very sure of itself, the way new things often are when they've waited long enough.